Hey friends, it's Melvin. Thanks for tuning into this episode. Here's just a few quick things I wanted to notify you guys about before we get started. First up, very soon, new episodes will be releasing Wednesday mornings rather than Tuesday. So don't panic if you don't see a new episode on Tuesday. Just wait a little longer and you'll see it in your feed. Second, we've introduced a mailbag. Check those show notes and toward the bottom you'll see a mailbag link. You'll then be able to text us any questions you might have about movies, the movie industry, or any movie/Christian related questions you might have. Then we'll respond in a future episode, so send us your questions now. Up next, Patreon polls, which are available to Patreon supporters at the $3 tier or higher, have been updated. Supporters can now suggest films or shows to be reviewed at the end of each month. The two most liked submissions will become the options for the Patreon poll, so if you want to hear us talk about your favorite movie or show, join our Patreon and start campaigning. And lastly, whether you're a new or longtime listener, please consider writing a review or rating the Cinematic Doctrine podcast on iTunes and Spotify. Apart from financially supporting on Patreon, these are the two most helpful ways to support the show. And that's it. Enjoy the episode. Hi, my name's Melvin, and working from home gets tiresome. Welcome to Cinematic Doctrine, a Christian podcast service that seeks to encourage and equip Christians to engage and reform the culture of cinema. In this episode, I'll be joined again by Caleb Young of the Polymath Roundtable, and the two of us will be discussing Jon Favreau's divisive sequel, Iron Man 2. As we work our way through reviewing Phase 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I couldn't help but bring back Caleb to talk about Iron Man 2, which at the time was the highly anticipated sequel to 2008's total breakout film. Caleb hails from the Polymath Roundtable, a semi-weekly Christian podcast that produces bite-sized reviews and topical discussions on all sorts of media. Some episodes he is talking about movies, others he's discussing books, and at other times he's looking at video games. Its well-rounded and often balanced pursuit makes for easy listening on your daily drive or when you need some good old Christian thoughts on all kinds of topics. And with Caleb's return, we eagerly look forward to talking about the divisive Iron Man 2. Right off the bat, we start talking about how our thoughts on the film don't seem to be the same as everyone else's. In fact, we both really enjoyed Iron Man 2. And this led to a great discussion on enjoying something that's not only divisive, but has a difficult history, as those who followed the production of Iron Man 2 may recall. The Lord really kept us on that topic, as we questioned the value of using products that come from a problematic history, or engaging media produced by people whose sin have been made public. It may sound like we get a bit off track, but I implore you to keep listening, because I think it's the kind of discussion we should be having. Looking at the history of the media we watch is as important as the media we watch. Anyways, if you have no idea what Iron Man 2 is about, don't fret. I've got you covered. Here's a quick synopsis I've adapted from IMDb. With the world now aware of his dual life as the armored superhero Iron Man, billionaire inventor Tony Stark faces pressure from the government, the press, and the public to share his technology with the military. Unwilling to let go of his invention, Stark, along with Pepper Potts and James Rhodes at his side, must forge new alliances and confront powerful enemies, all while Tony Stark recovers from an infection that's caused by the very thing that's keeping him alive. Iron Man 2 is rated PG-13 for sequences of intense sci-fi action and violence, and some language. The intense sci-fi action relates to scenes of big, bulking suits of flying iron beating the tar out of one another, as well as the occasional mayhem. There's plenty of weaponry getting fired all around, so that's something to be aware of. There's also a frightening sequence in the beginning of the film where a bunch of second-rate Iron Man suits constructed by a competitor are shown to be malfunctioning. This sequence has some frightening, suggestive visuals that I recall being a bit frightened of when I was a kid, so I feel like I should mention that. The language is a mixture of what's said and what's suggested. There are some words that are also censored, such as the F word. This film has a fair amount of swearing, as well as a play on words at the very end that may be bothersome. And I'll say I'm probably not the only one surprised that the certificate doesn't have anything regarding suggestive imagery, because man, these Iron Man movies can get pretty raunchy. There are also some off-color and suggestive jokes that are quite offensive to most sensibilities, some of which are delivered by Tony Stark. There are also brief segments of a character in their underwear, one of which is rather egregious, while the other one is in a car. They're both played off for laughs, and it's just the strangest, most unexpected thing despite Tony's Playboy style character. It's weird. Now, before we head into our Iron Man 2 discussion, I wanted to share real quick that if you've come to enjoy Cinematic Doctrine, consider leaving a review for the podcast on your respective podcast app at the end of this episode. Unlike YouTube or Reddit, there isn't really a way to let us know how we're doing with a thumbs up or thumbs down, so the best way is to leave your thoughts on the podcast with a review on iTunes, Podchaser, or wherever you're listening. Apart from that, Cinematic Doctrine also has a Patreon. For those who don't know, Patreon is a website for independent content creators to raise support for their work. By creating an account on Patreon, you can select a content creator you like and support them with a monthly donation. If you enjoy Cinematic Doctrine and would like to support the show, consider donating, as it helps cover the cost of producing the podcast. And as a bonus, if you support Cinematic Doctrine for as little as $3 a month, you're opted into a once-a-month movie poll where you decide a movie we discuss on the podcast. You also gain access to the Syndoc Pre-Show, the upcoming Patreon-exclusive podcast series where my co-host Daniel and I casually talk movies, Christianity, and life itself. There are other unique benefits that come with supporting the podcast, so be sure to check them out at patreon.com/cinematic doctrine. And of course, you can also listen to Caleb Young's wonderful podcast, The Polymath Roundtable, on your favorite podcast app. Listen to Father Polymath as he looks at all kinds of media, from movies, books, and video games through a Christian lens, and really gets down to the brass tacks of what you're engaging, all in a bite-sized runtime. Without further ado, here's our thoughts on Iron Man 2. Caleb, that Iron Man episode was so good, I couldn't help to have you back. So what's going on, man? How you doing?
I'm doing good. Honestly, I can't wait to be able to talk about this because, honestly, this is maybe my second favorite MCU movie, just flat out.
That's awesome, because, yeah, I had a good time with it, too, rewatching it, which, just thinking about, like, the history of this film and, like, how people have responded to it, like, especially even now, looking at it retrospectively, this is going to be a very interesting episode, I feel like. But before we get started, Caleb, why don't you tell everybody about your podcast?
Well, I run the Polymath Roundtable, a semi-weekly media review podcast. I talk about everything from books to movies to video games to TV shows, both modern and old, and I try to do it all from a Christian perspective. I'm not looking to dive into the nitty-gritty, here, let's spend 30 minutes discussing about exact meaning of this phrase or something. I want to give you the tools to sit down and say, okay, this movie has a message for me. What is it trying to tell me, both on the surface, what's the story, but also what is the underlying message that maybe it's not explicitly told, but it is still being shown, and oftentimes is a little more subtle and in many ways insidious. So it's all available online everywhere podcasts are available. The Polymath Roundtable on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts, all that, as well as my own website, polymathroundtable.com. I'm also, you can also find me on Podchaser or on Facebook as the Polymath Roundtable.
Yeah, and if you're coming in after listening to our Iron Man episode, we were talking about how, like he says, it's like they're quick, bite-sized things you need to know or things you should think about if you are going to engage certain forms of media. I've mentioned in the Iron Man episode that I really enjoyed the Witcher discussion as well, so go ahead and check that out.
I actually just launched a brand new series, actually today, the day we're recording this episode, talking about retro movies from my childhood and before. A lot of movie reviews, yeah, you can always find somebody to talk about the latest thing in the theater. But, if you go back 10 years, 15 years, no one ever talks about the Disney movies from my childhood. And that's what I'm doing. Starting now, every Thursday, I'm releasing an episode talking about classic movies. And, for example, today's episode is about The Love Bug.
That's pretty fun.
I called it Steve McQueen meets It's a Wonderful Life, now with 50% more tar.
That's awesome. I'll be excited if you ever cover The Iron Giant. Now, that would be one I'd love to hear you talk about.
Okay, you're going to laugh at me. I've never actually made it all the way through. I was watching it with my brother last year, and I think family got home, and so it got put on pause, and I never finished it.
You should definitely try and finish it. That's a pretty good one. I remember a few years ago,
they were showing it again in theaters with like an extra scene, and I think the reason they did that is because they were gauging like interest in a sequel, stuff like that. Because even though like it's one of those movies I think a lot of people have fond memories of, I think it's closer to cult status than it is like franchise potential. But yeah, that would be an interesting one to hear you
There's a
cover.
lot of movies out there which have a lot of worth and value to them, but I almost say that they're better as a one-off film rather than going off into numbers 1 through 5 and 7.
Yes, yeah, I completely agree with that.
But then again, I've got a soft spot for the B-roll sequel film type deal.
Yes, yes.
Pacific Rim.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Where it went from like kind of a good movie with Guillermo del Toro just having a blast with giant creatures to just full out camp.
Yeah, I mean, sheesh, the action montage in the middle of making everything new. Oh,
Yeah, just crazy. But talking about films that are good as one-offs, we of course are talking about the MCU here at Cinematic Doctrine as we go through this series, and there are more than just one, maybe even more than two MCU movies. I can't quite remember how many, but we are here talking about Iron Man 2. And I definitely recommend going back to hear us, Caleb and I, talk about Iron Man 1. It's a very, very interesting episode, one that I personally thoroughly enjoyed, and then even really enjoyed listening to again as I did my editing. Here we are now with Iron Man 2, which hopefully, if you haven't listened to the other, you still have at the very least seen this movie that is over a decade old, right? I think this is a decade old, 2010 or 2011.
it's 11 years old now. I know this
Wow.
because it was the summer of the year I turned 16, and I was taking a class at my local college. There was a cheap theater, last run theater next to the park and ride, and I'm not joking. I saw Iron Man 2 at least 8 times at that theater over the summer.
I believe it. I absolutely believe it.
I love Iron Man. I love the character and the world, but there's something about this film that just touches all the right bases for me in what I love in a film. And there's definitely a bunch of problems, but at the same time, something about this film is just so much fun. Everything about it just is so iconic, and a lot of the problems that we had with Iron Man 1 in the terms of like how it looks and the overall blandness of a lot of positioning. There's no memorable, scene in your head. This movie has just so many iconic visuals in it.
Yeah, I was actually quite impressed with the cinematography and the lighting with this movie as well. I actually was thinking to myself, I think this is the best looking Phase 1 movie that I've watched. In particular, there was just this lighting towards the end of the movie when Pepper Potts is sitting in the audience as Hammer is unveiling a particular thing on stage, and when they cut away to show Pepper Potts sitting in the audience, there was just this really great singular, very movie-like lighting on her character while everyone else was faded out, and it had like this really beautiful gold look to it. And I thought to myself, like, man, like I have been noticing really great shots, and for some reason, this one is the one that I'm remembering right now. It was just like it just looked great. It would look so good.
For me, the one scene, the one shot that just popped out and stuck out in my head for me was that sequence right in the first 25 minutes of the film, I think it is, where our antagonist first shows up on screen and he walks out and the jumpsuit burns away around his body,
Yes, that was
and
awesome.
he throws out those whips, and you're just like, oh my goodness, now things are happening.
It's just a good introduction. Like it just is so intense, and especially during a scene that's can be I would argue is the first kind of disorienting scene in the movie, and we'll be getting into certain things that people don't like about Iron Man 2 because it very much seems like me and Caleb are perhaps the only two people on the planet who like this movie.
It's a
But
shame.
it is a shame, but it's funny how like that scene, despite what might be disorienting to people, Like, it's still a really good introduction for who will soon be known as Whiplash. I mean, this, like, don't even care attitude of walking out into, like, a road that is currently being used for racers. So this guy could just get obliterated in a second if somebody hits him.
Yeah,
And he's like, I'm here for one thing and one thing only, and it's Tony Stark. And I don't know. It was just, I loved the visuals in this movie. They're just so good.
playing off that, this is, I think, the movie where we first start seeing the brilliant casting just come through in just this incredible level, creating characters who are iconic and unmistakable. You know, we talked about how amazing RDJ was as Iron Man, but this is where they start fleshing out those side characters to make them a whole lot more, and they also start setting up the rest of the MCU. I mean, Mickey Rourke, he's the guy who played Whiplash, or Ivan Vanko. Wow. I mean, everything about him was just done so well to create this character that, on the one hand, you really sympathize with, but on the other hand, you're just like, "Ugh, he makes my skin crawl. He's, he's evil and he's Russian," and you're like, this back and forth of the guy who's trying to avenge his father, but at the same time, he is tainted with great evil himself, and he's not on a holy justice war. He is here for revenge and blood money. And then we get to Hammer.
Yeah, and then you have Sam Rockwell, who's just having a blast as Hammer, and this is just before he ends up going into playing. He plays a character in Duncan Jones's Moon, which he also just has such a good performance in, and it's just like, this is when I think this is the thing about the MCU that really is perhaps their best attribute, and it's casting. They cast really great actors in roles that most productions I think would just have B grade, and I mean that not in a negative way, but more like they're not like your Matt Damons, and they're not like your, well, your even your Gwyneth Paltrow's or Robert Downey Jr.'s and stuff, but they're basically casting people who are very good and well known in certain cases. I mean, Mickey Rourke being Whiplash is like crazy, and these people just bring it all in. It's just great to see. I don't know. I think like the thing that I'm getting the most from phase 1, and we'll even see into phase 2 and 3, is the fact that the MCU doesn't spare money when it comes to just getting actors that are just so good. It's awesome.
Well, I think their power is not that it's, the power to spend money, but rather the very Stan Lee and, in a lot of ways, Tolkien knowledge that the little people matter, that the little people can make a big difference, and that
Mm.
happens both in the story and in the universe, where throwaway characters, one-off characters matter in a lot of ways. I mean, look at Happy. He's a director cameo, but at the same time, he adds this interaction level to connect the highfalutin superhero to the individual man. That, yeah, he's Tony Stark, the rich guy. He is Iron Man, but at the same time, he works out with Happy. He has this relationship, this friendship with Happy that it matters to both him and to Happy. And you're like, maybe I'm not Iron Man, but I could be Happy. Over and over again, you see those moments where the side character is given enough love that maybe in the future something happens.
Yeah, it's great how they really don't let people, in most cases, characters that are on the side still have interaction with your leads, introduce new things to your leads. They also can shake things up and be brought back in a way that's actually pretty big. In fact, the later Thor movies have this with a particular character that's introduced in Thor Ragnarok.
Well, I mean, look at the current ones. I mean, you've got Agent Coulson.
Exact. Yeah, Agent Coulson is like I think the one character that in phase one is, everybody would agree, is a side character, but then is so memorable when it comes to phase one's experience.
If you disobey, I'm going to tase you, and then
Yes.
watch Super Nanny while you drool underneath the table.
Yes, yeah, it's so good. And he just carries it so well. And they decide, you know what, a character that's on the side like Agent Coulson, rather than just him being normal, let's actually think about his characteristics. Oh, well, he just delivers all of his lines like he's in complete control of himself. Even if it's something funny, he won't even laugh, but you know he's laughing on the inside. So it's great.
He's in complete control of the situation, and yes, he will do his duty. Mm-hmm. Goodbye. I've been seconded to New Mexico.
Yes, exactly. It's great.
And that brings up the whole thing of how so many of these side characters, they're not one-offs. They have their own story that happens in the sideline, which makes the main story, in my view, much more rich, because it's not a one-track story. You're like, oh, all these other things are happening at the same time. There's depth to this world.
Yeah, and I think that's actually best exemplified by something I didn't realize until just recently. And this isn't really spoilers in any way, shape, or any way or shape of it. But technically speaking, like when it comes to the importance of side characters, you could quite literally say that in the entire Iron Man trilogy, each movie ends with Pepper Potts saving the day, or getting the bad guy. If you're listening to this episode, you probably already have watched Iron Man 1. I'm sure you have definitely watched Iron Man 1. And the way that movie ends is basically Pepper Potts has to do something, and she does it and saves the day, even though Iron Man is the title character. And then in this film, the same thing kind of happens. Like, she's the one who initiates a particular thing that happens to a character who is also a villain. And then, even just looking forward to Iron Man 3, again, this really isn't spoilers. It's just her particular character arc is so pivotal to the way that ends. And it's just so interesting that she's not even the title character. And yes, she is, of course, the love interest of Tony Stark. But like, she's given quite a lot to do. And I would even say, especially in the form of Iron Man 2, even though this film doesn't pass a Bechdel test by any means, um, this film, when it comes to like Pepper Potts, she is a very important female role and character. Now, the same cannot be said about Scarlett Johansson, who basically is just treated like a sex icon in this movie, which is a real shame. But it's very nice to know that, not even spoilers, by the time they get to the Avengers, they have figured out what she's supposed to be. And it's not just some walking sex icon, which, thank goodness for that.
Well, I'm a little bit conflicted, because on the one hand, I hate the characterization of, like I said, the sex icons side, but at the same time, I don't think anyone at that point expected Natasha Romanoff to become the Black Widow, because nobody was looking ahead to Infinity War or what have you. It was still very early days in, can we make a world where everything's a little bit bigger? And I'm going to say something a little bit controversial. I think her uniform in this film is possibly less scandalous than her future uniform. Her future leather and sinuous catsuit is possibly even more disturbing than the cleavage and curls display that we have in this film.
Yeah, I can't. I actually, so I just watched the Avengers 2 days ago, and yes, her leather outfit in that is perhaps just a little too. I'll say this: the camera doesn't pan across her like as if to say, "Look, she's in leather." I somewhat agree. However, it is always strange that, like, I mean, I even think of. Have you ever played the Batman Arkham games, the Arkham trilogy?
Yeah.
You remember how Catwoman is designed in Arkham Asylum, and it's like she has this full outfit, but then she still has the zipper down super low, and you're like, you do realize that it's snowing outside. Do you maybe want to zip that up? It's just it. I do think, like, though, like you're saying, I think in Iron Man 2, if we're gauging respect towards a particular person's outfit, her zipper is all the way up, but they still keep making jokes about, there's two particular jokes that were like, I cannot believe that they're making this joke, which again, we talked about this at length, that Iron Man 1 has a bit of this tonal issue. But Iron Man 2 also has, like, when her character is introduced, Tony is researching her and finds lingerie imagery of her. And you're like, please do not zoom in. And then, of course, Tony Stark zooms in and you're like, by gosh golly, Tony, please stop doing that.
I did appreciate how Pepper's just like smack down, no, bad Tony.
Yes, I'm glad she's just not taking Tony for what he's trying to do.
Once again, Tony is a playboy persona
Yes.
at times, and once again, it's shown to be bad.
I'm glad that in this one they show that it's to be bad more than the first one.
Yeah, it's more explicitly shown out in this one, which is definitely an appreciation. We haven't even addressed the party in the room.
I thought that was better handled, though. So there's a particular, assuming we're thinking the same thing, there's a particular scene in the movie where, you know, Tony Stark is, as you've heard about in the beginning, he's really struggling with a lot of these changes. Like, he has this thing that, you know, is in his chest trying to keep him alive, keep the shrapnel from the explosion from getting into his heart. But while it's keeping the shrapnel from killing him, the device itself is poisoning him. And so he's kind of living this aspect of like, I'm here to save the world and I'm so important, but also I'm dying. And the thing that I'm doing to keep the world safe is killing me. And so there's a scene later on where he just sort of parties and does whatever he wants. And he's very wasted. And there's a lot of women, thankfully, wearing largely appropriate clothing, but still kind of party clothes. I gotta say, though, I thought this was one of the best scenes I'd seen, probably in phase one, just because thinking about it narratively, I thought it was just it's a dark place for a person to be, and it's a dark thing to watch on screen. But the anxiety that I experienced watching it was effective. I mean, the fact that the one thing that I seem to have neglected to mention is that he's wasted in his Iron Man suit, which means he could blow
Yes.
things up at any minute. And that is like really, like, that was a really creative scene to just make me so scared for everybody in that room.
Yeah, I gotta say, there's issues, as always, with a Hollywood production. But from a narrative standpoint, from someone outside the production, this is a phenomenal film. Everything, there's all these world building moments. There's this massive amount of character development where you take Tony, who he's still the arrogant jerk, but has learned that, there's a role and a time to be a hero. And now he's going through this new phase of trying to figure out, at what point do I stop being a hero? Do I am I supposed to be selfish at some point? Do I sacrifice everything? Do I sacrifice nothing? And he plays off into the legacy of, do I live up to my father's legacy, or do I burn his legacy? Other people hate my legacy. What does that make me? There's so much going on here that advances so far the entire universe that they're starting to build in the MCU.
Yeah, and I think they balance it well. I know some other people don't, and that's actually going to probably be our next talking point, is the amount of people that don't like this movie, including the particular people that don't like this movie. But I agree. I'm kind of leaning on the side that I feel like this movie handles these really complex things that are going on with Tony Stark's experience of legacy. I mean, the fact that he's also very much thinking that he's going to die very soon means like he's preparing, like, when I die, what is going to be the lasting legacy of this? But then also having to struggle with the fact that, like, I'm not dead yet and I still kind of want to just have a good time, which unfortunately he believes is getting drunk and partying, drink and be merry kind of thing. And again, I think it's handled well, and I think that leads to one of the best fight scenes in the MCU, purely because it's not just two dudes fighting like good versus evil. it is a sequence that's very much what makes it tense is the two characters that are fighting. What makes it tense isn't that this person's just the bad guy and so you're just hoping that somebody wins. What makes it tense is that these two people who are close friends, these two people that care for each other, are now fighting so aggressively and so violently you could expect one of them to kill each other within seconds. That to me is so much better to watch now, knowing, like, just looking at the franchise, to see that scene and recognize, like, this is going to define the relationship, at least maybe for the next hour, because I think by the end everyone kind of just gets along. But I don't know, it's a weird movie. I think that's something that I really took away with it, is that ultimately Iron Man 2 is a weird movie. And the thing about weird movies is sometimes, rightfully so, they just stay weird and people don't like them. But other times you just like weird. And for me, as someone who has seen many movies and therefore has seen the same story just with a different coat of paint over and over, something about Iron Man 2 just kind of having a billion different plot lines with a billion characters and like very different sequences, just to me is like, interestingly enough, a breath of fresh air. So it's fascinating to me.
Iron Man 2 really sticks with me despite the million storylines because it narratively brings them all to a close or leaves them artfully positioned for a future film. Whether that's Coulson being called out to New Mexico, wink, 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 which, if you know your franchise history, means, oh, wait, this positions this right at the same time as Thor 1, eh?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
now I've got a connection there. But all these different storylines get, told, and you see the full progression, like Vanko. You see why he's doing what he does, what he does with it, and then it closes his storyline. And yes, there's this bit of disconcerting what is going on in about the hour, 15-minute point in the film, but it brings it all back in and wraps it up at the end. And I am just to say this film really sets off my one major undying fury towards the MCU.
Ooh, I'm curious. What is it?
Death.
Okay.
I love superhero films. I love the comics, the comic cartoons, and it's a terrible world where you create a brilliant character and then wipe him away, never to be seen again. I mean, yes, sometimes it needs to happen. Sometimes a character just he reaches the end and that's it. There needs to be no more. I would argue that you reach that point at the end of I think it's phase 3 with a certain happenstance.
Yes, by the time phase 3 comes along, there are definitely characters who have died.
But especially when it comes to villains in the comic book franchise world, it's a waste, honestly, to see a character with such potential, even if it's played out beautifully on the screen for that one film, to have it be that one film only leaves the world a little bit lacking when it happens. I mean, at the end of the film, Vanko is killed.
Yes.
It's unmistakable. But that means that there's no more Whiplash. There's no more Mickey Rourke, Ivan Vanko in this film, or in the future films. And you see this problem over and over in the MCU, where they bring in these brilliant characters, and you grow to love them or hate them. Your whole movie watching experience is intertwined into this one film, and then yoink! That's all, folks. That's all, folks.
Yeah.
It's done. I mean, they managed to fix that for a couple characters through, shall we say, arcane powers and so forth.
Yes.
But, I mean, Ironmonger. and or Vanko, to use these in particular because of the phase that we're in discussing. There's no more of them, which means all that buildup is no more. There's no lasting arch enemy to deal with.
Yeah, and what's even interesting is comparing this to a character like Hammer, who is alive by the end of this movie, and people have been wanting to come back. But for some reason, Kevin Feige's just decided, I don't really want to. In fact, we know he's still alive because
We know that Hammer is still alive because of the Thor DVD special short film.
not only that, you also have mentions of him in the Netflix series that Hammer is still making weapons in the world of the Marvel Netflix cinematic universe, I guess. I mean, they're still part, they're just very extended as far as that's concerned. But yeah, Hammer's still around. Sam Rockwell says like he'd love to come back to do the character. And like, as far as Kevin Feige's concerned, it seems like, Hammer is just dead. Like, because he's just not using him for anything. And so while I agree it is disappointing that like you might have these situations where certain villains end up dying for good, and so we don't get their what they represent ideologically, we don't get to see them anymore. But when I think about how Kevin Feige has this strong grip on what he wants to tell across all of them, and not just Kevin Feige, whatever the committee is basically alongside him, it's it's interesting for me to think too that like there are characters that are still alive and have been since phase one. Hammer has been alive since phase one, guys. That he's just not back. And just because I feel inclined to say this, and this thread doesn't need to go anywhere, I honestly think he may come back in the third Tom Holland Spider-Man movie. I think that would be perfect to bring back Sam Rockwell to reprise his role as Hammer.
Actually, I think there's a better spot, actually.
What is it? I'm curious.
Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings.
Place your bets, guys. Who's it gonna be?
The reason why I say that would be a better film to bring him back, Hammer back in, is because of the Marvel short film All Hail the King. After the events of Iron Man 3, due to some dissension among the viewers, Marvel released a short film that fixed some issues, and Hammer was shown alive and still machinating, still committing machinations and trying to get his life.
Still running his company.
Yes. And trying to connect himself with a future character who I believe should be a critical plot point in Shang-Chi.
Okay, I think that could be interesting. Yeah, well, I guess we'll have to wait and see if movies ever exist after the current pandemic. We'll have to we'll have to figure that one out, I guess. So yeah, we've mentioned, I mean, this is something that you were talking about, like death, like the characters don't come back, but there's also, not just narratively speaking, did Ivan die, did Whiplash die, did Mickey Rourke's character die and therefore not come back. We can also go back and just look at the behind the scenes information surrounding Iron Man 2 and begin to understand a bit more as to why Mickey Rourke hasn't come back. And a lot of that, again, comes down to the production issues. So, for instance, there's a lot of S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff in Iron Man 2. There's a lot of the Avengers preparation that is in Iron Man 2. In fact, a lot of this is why, a lot of these choices is why Jon Favreau chose not to return for Iron Man 3. Mickey Rourke says currently that he just doesn't want to do another, quote, mindless comic book movie, unquote, knowing that so much of his work will just land on the cutting room floor. And then even Robert Downey Jr. himself saying that Iron Man 2 was, quote, dissatisfying and disappointing, end quote, which is, again, very interesting for us to read as two people who quite enjoy this movie. And a lot of that, again, has to do with the fact that producers above Jon Favreau and above even Mickey Rourke, who helped contribute to certain choices behind the scenes that were going to be used for Ivan's character, were sidelined to then push in more Shield stuff, to push in more Avengers stuff, because you only have so much time in a movie, and you can only expect audiences to put up with so much time in a movie before they're like, all right, it's too long, it's too boring, and so they have to cut some things out. And point is, there's just a lot of distaste for Iron Man 2, even from the people behind the scenes. There are people like us who quite like it. There are other people as audience members who really don't like Iron Man 2 for a variety of reasons, and I believe they're quite valid. Like I said, this is a weird movie. But there's also the people behind the scenes who worked on the movie. They didn't like the production, and a lot of their original work was scrapped by producers who wanted things to be simple and focused on world building, and therefore it was pretty strenuous. And this always gets me thinking about other films that people like, but ultimately were the work of disgruntled employees, arguments, that sort of thing. And this isn't the only industry to have this issue. If you guys keep up on video game news and the amount of crunch time that is
Oh,
put on companies that make games that you love, and it's not just crunch that like people voluntarily do, it's more like they're manipulated into it, that like if you care about the product, you will work 16 hours a day and you will sleep at your desk kind of manipulation. Because if you only work your 8 hours and you go home, then you must not care that much about it. And so the reason I make that comparison is because there are things we enjoy that when you think about how it was made, nobody enjoyed it. Like they might get to the other end and then the thing that they worked on is appreciated. And then you can almost say like, well, all that work I put into it was worth it. But I'm also reminded of reading Greg Sestero's book, The Disaster Artist. Now, if you don't recognize either of those names, Greg Sestero is one of the actors of the much, I don't know how to describe this, the much loved, so bad it's good movie called The Room. The particular movie that still sells out midnight showings to people who want to throw spoons at their screen, because this movie is so bad and so alien that it's actually really fun to watch. But the thing about this movie is that the production of it was miserable, traumatic, horrible, just horrible. And you can read all about it in The Disaster Artist, which is a great book, a page turner. And it's also just a very interesting piece about like somebody just having a vision and just not compromising, no matter the fact that like it could just turn out terrible. But in the end, even Greg Sestero himself in the very beginning of the book says like, knowing the experience of making that movie and coming out on the other side and seeing that people still kind of enjoy it, what does it mean to make successful art? But that's not the question I'm really interested in asking. I'm more interested about the idea that we enjoy certain products and certain things that have horrible history. And while the production story of Iron Man 2 and The Room, or even crunch time on video games, are nowhere near similar, although you would be surprised about the crunch time that it takes for CGI, I think the question still stands as someone who somewhat enjoys Iron Man 2, and Caleb, you would agree as well with the enjoyment of Iron Man 2. I just begin to question my enjoyment of something that people found horrible to work on. But what do you think about that, Caleb? What do you think about the fact that you and I both kind of like this movie a whole lot, and yet everybody involved sort of hates it, and it's plagued with production issues and horrible memories? What do you think about that?
I mean, honestly, I don't at
All
all.
right, perfect.
The thing is, so much of the stuff in our lives on an actual daily life basis has, if you look hard enough, something terrible involved with it. I mean, okay, what sort of phone do you have? An iPhone or Android. No matter what phone you've got, those chips and phones and pieces involved were created in a factory in China. Basically, all iPhones are created. They have to put up suicide prevention nets because of how much stress the people are under. Not to mention the corporate culture at Apple. And that's just your phone. We're not talking about, anything else. And your clothing is most likely produced in a sweatshop at some
You
point.
could even talk about diamonds. I mean, the entire market of diamonds is Like, it's horrible to read about. Like, every diamond's basically a blood diamond, but continue.
The point I want to make is that, especially, or should I say, particularly when it comes to art, I don't think that because other people were terrible, we should feel terrible about liking what was made. I don't think that just because, okay, to use an extreme example, Jared Leto is an absolute horrifying individual on the set for Suicide Squad. I think it was Suicide Squad.
Yes, Suicide Squad. He, I believe, mailed like dead animals to people. Is really, really strange guy.
He a horrific individual, I would say. And just setting aside whether or not the whole genre of anti-hero is a worthy genre for a Christian to be partaking in and glorifying in, I don't think that because one person or a production team is either terrible people or maybe didn't make choices that everybody liked, mean it doesn't. I don't think it should taint the final production, if that makes sense. If you enjoy the film, as long as there's not a specific moral thing like, oh, they went and filmed a genocide for fun and then made a film out of it, that should make you feel terrible. But Mickey Rourke being miffed that his character got a lot of screen time cut down, that feels kind of lame, you know?
Sure, and I actually really like that you went that direction, the direction that, like, let's look at other products we have that have bad history. We haven't done. Someday I'll get that uncut gems episode recorded or whatever. But even thinking about like things we like that are beautiful, like diamonds, is like the stuff that goes into the very small amount of money these people are making when they're mining for diamonds, the conditions. If you're riding, even more like stateside, if you're riding on a train, do you know who had to lay those tracks? Do you know the treatment they went through when they had to build trains through mountains? Like, there was immense racism towards Chinese people, and they were basically told to carry, and this is like pre-dynamite, so it's literally just the chemicals that if you just drop will explode. And we're told to carry these vials into the mountain and then place it and then leave. And like these people just would like have limbs blown off and then told go do it again and stuff like that. So you're riding on a train, it's on the backs of horrible things. In fact, if you really even think about the fact that a lot of modern medicine was due to the advancements of like post World War II, the United States acquiring Nazi scientists who most definitely were not moral in their studies, your ibuprofen and your stuff like that is built, which I'm not saying quote me on the fact that ibuprofen is specifically tied to Nazi science.
You know what it is, actually?
Is it really ibuprofen?
Well, actually, I was trying to say there's a even more stark example. Hypothermia. Most of our protocols for how, responding to hypothermia are based on a series of horrific experiments conducted by the mad Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele, who committed hundreds of thousands of war crimes in his mad experiments.
Yes. Yeah. And I think really the next step is thinking about like the fact that, I mean, and I thought you were going this direction with cell phones, but even the particular metals required for cell phone batteries is like it's sourced from Africa, and these people are having horrible conditions getting the materials and stuff. And then the fact that they have new phones every year and the other ones are obsolete is like horrible treatment of the work that they put into it. But I digress. I think it really heads into the direction of like how far, two things: how far will man go to excuse itself, and also can man pay for even its own accidental involvement in promoting these sorts of things. And I think there's an argument to be had that like, well, I'm just buying a cell phone because I need it for work, and therefore I'm not really involved with it. In fact, you can go back to the New Testament, and you can see in Paul's letters there's an argument about, like, these people are buying meat that was sacrificed to other gods. Is it immoral to be eating these meats? And in the letter, it's like, no, it's not. But if it would cause your brother to sin, don't do it. And so it's encouraged within that congregation, please don't buy meats that are sacrificed to other gods, even though Paul agrees you can still do that.
If I can bring this back to the film, and you're talking about, should we revel in this film that was, had such a tawdry history behind it, if you will. And I like the point you made that, there's a lot of terrible stuff happening, and we as humans will excuse our way out of it as much as possible. And I think the question that needs to be asked is, A, what level of terrible is this?
That's a good question.
Is this actors miffed, whether my introspective dialogue on the real meaning of Vanko's revenge got cut, or is this actual literal exploitation of people and sin?
Yes, yeah.
So that's one question we need to ask. But also, I think there's a measure of balance between, because honestly, when it comes to things that sourced from exploited people, honestly speaking, at some point, no matter what you're doing, it's built in part upon a sinful act. And I can't think of any bit of medicine or technology that at some point was not tainted. And we have to ask ourselves, at what point do we stop apologizing? Do we, write off the technology entirely? Do we accept the technology or the medicine and say, okay, it was created by an evil guy, but now it's being used for good? I mean, you can look at pornography and say, oh, that taints the entire film industry. Or you can say, they're using it for evil, we can use it for good. If that makes sense.
Sure. And this goes without clarifying, but I understand that you're saying the film industry we can use for good, not pornography.
Yes.
I just can I can see the email being like,
how dare you?
I can't believe you would say that. And it's like, well, first off, I didn't, but also this is what he meant. So I just gotta say it, just gotta make it clear.
Yes.
This should honestly really encourage us more to lean on Christ for two reasons. One, to say, like, God, forgive me for any of my involvement in this, because there are certain ways in which, even though, yeah, you're just purchasing a product, and just as mentioned before, the idea of like this was sacrificed for foreign gods can still be not sinful to eat that meat. And therefore, if I think about it like candy, like if a candy was produced purely for the selfish pride of the one who made it, but it's good tasting candy and I can eat it and enjoy it, I would not argue I'm sinning unless I'm trying to do it in worship of that person. It might just literally be for the sake of brief enjoyment.
Yeah, I mean, I watched a 20-minute video yesterday, actually, on a French guy who makes butter, and he's just waxing effervescent about the butter that he makes, and just how much joy and fulfillment he finds in this, making this butter, and how much it means to him.
It's like idol worship for butter.
Almost, not quite that.
I shouldn't laugh,
but at the same time, my partaking of the butter that he made is not committing a sin. His act of finding complete fulfillment in his butter might I say, be a sin. But because I enjoy the butter that he made, or I enjoy a car, a cell phone, this microphone, or Iron Man 2, does not mean that I also am in sin.
Right. And then even the other thing too is that, looking to Christ again, the hope, of course, is that Christ fulfills all things, and this even includes technological advancements where in the new earth, I mean, we're not going to need medicine on the new earth. All of that's going to be gone. But I remember discussing with one of my friends who's very academic and sciencey, and he said he likes to think that on the new earth we'll still be learning things. So for instance, some people will believe that just like how, Caleb, you and I are new creations and yet we're still kind of the same body, so too on the new earth it'll almost be like the same earth, just new, renewed, kind of like how I am renewed. I have a new heart. Now, I'm not saying I prescribe to that either. I'm just saying that that's something people believe. But from that example, thinking about living in the exact same universe, just, new, we still have a lot to learn about this universe. And it's not sinful to look forward and see like what really is in the Andromeda galaxy. And it's not a means of finding that out to make medicine, because again, there's not going to be that sickness or death or anything. But looking forward to the fact that Christ makes all things new, we know that something like a diamond would be wholesomely collected, not used by exploiting lesser people and paying them next to nothing. And by gosh golly, they sure don't have insurance and things like that. You could be confident knowing your cell phone wasn't created in a sweatshop. You could be confident knowing your shoes aren't made in a sweatshop, which a lot of them are. In fact, a lot of the things in our stores are almost entirely made overseas and in horrible conditions. And that's, of course, not even including horrible conditions here in the United States at times. In fact, even this movie kind of talks about the horrible treatment of other people. I mean, Ivan's entire character is built on getting revenge for the fact that his father was wrongfully kicked out of the company. Now, that can be morally debated considering the way that the two, like, Howard Stark and Ivan's father disagreed on something. But the point being was like Howard Stark and Ivan's dad both created arc reactor technology, and Howard was like, nope, kicking you out. You're like, oh, okay. That wasn't moral. But okay.
Well, I mean, I might have misheard something in the film, but I thought it was made clear that Vanko was selling secrets to the Russians.
Oh, I think you're right. So okay, maybe maybe he's right.
Just saying that it's not quite that one-sided.
Not as dastardly as I'm making it sound.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's so good to see that the most important thing to think about when it is about Christ is that he is reconciling our relationship to God. Like I have sinned against God, and therefore I incur the wrath of God. And it is only God who can send something to fix that, and that's Christ. And believing in Christ's love and death on the cross for me takes that wrath and points it to Christ on the cross. However, Christ is so much more powerful than that. And he can do whatever he wants. And that also includes renewing all of creation. And that even includes like how we go about life, getting things and doing things and stuff, because it'll depress you if you decide to just look up, where did my Nikes come from? You will be so sad. Even video game consoles. I don't know if you saw that story that broke a month or two ago about literal like Chinese genocide of a type of a people group, and it was found out that working in those factories, they were building Nintendo Switches and Xbox Ones and Dell PCs, and you're like, holy crap!
Mm-hmm.
I have that stuff in my house. It's crazy.
And I was reading Hebrews this morning, and I found comfort in it, which I thought really applied to this discussion very well. In Hebrews, it talks about the cloud of witnesses, about all those before the time of Christ who believed in the hope that was to come and were redeemed because of that trust and belief. And it also talks about how, we as Christians are disciplined and conformed to Christ, which we're given this example of all these Christian or all these believers who did their best to believe. And I'm listening to you talk, and all I can think is, man, if Christ is redeeming those who believed, he's also condemning those who did not believe.
Yeah.
The people listed here in Hebrews were hundreds and thousands of years before Christ, and talking about how these, the belief of those people is what witnesses to us. Their faith is the faith that we should be believing in as well, which gives me comfort when I look at this situation of, there's all these terrible things, there's all these horrible things, that God's power is over that too. That those who commit these horrible crimes or have committed horrible deeds in the past are still going to be held accountable.
Yes.
Our faith here 1,000 years after, or 2,000 years after these letters were written, our faith is being called and said, look back 4,000 years. This chain of faith in your salvation is what your salvation is based on in a lot of ways. At the same time, there's the corollary that just as he redeems the faithful, he punishes the unfaithful. He condemns the sinful. And I can trust that just as he sees my secret heart and I am redeemed now, he is also working on the sinful out there. That it's not on me to avenge every little aspect of what's gone wrong in this world, because I cannot fix this world. I'm not that strong, that powerful. I am not Iron Man. I cannot privatize world peace.
Yes, right. That's right.
But I can trust in the one who his will be done, and he will be glorified, whether that's now or in the future when the entire world is shaken and riven in two and a new world is brought forth.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to basically not look at all of these things that have histories of violence and histories of disaster. I mean, even just the fact that we live in the United States, we look back and we see our history as a nation is diabolical. A nation that espouses that it was made for free men, and then for more than half of it had slaves, and that I don't know, I think less than half, sorry, I researched for Iron Man 2, all right? I didn't research. It's just, but the point being is we still have this history of horrible treatment of anyone that's basically not European. And then actually that's not even true. Italians were hated as well.
Well, I mean, honestly, if we just look at it fairly, the entire world has a history of treating everybody horribly.
Yes, let's be real here. And so the point being is not to stare at these things and just feel dread and go, gosh, everything's so horrible, God must be dead. That can't be where we stop, because that's a horrible place to stop.
We cannot be paralyzed in fear.
Yeah.
We say that the world is terrible. The world is scarred and marred by sin. But there's hope.
Yes.
We have faith. It's something greater, bigger, longer than what we have here. And we have faith that there is justice, true justice, not the temporary justice of somebody getting fired or even a prison sentence.
Yeah.
But eternal, perfect justice.
And yeah, if we do not rest in that and keep our eyes facing forward in the faith that the Lord will honor his side, basically, and he will, it's going to be very easy to keep looking back and say that, if everything's terrible, then it's going to stay terrible now. And it's not. It just isn't. If it did, then God wouldn't be who he says he is. Then yeah, I mean, I would agree with Paul. Then we are the saddest people on this earth to believe in something so fake. But the reality is we don't. And I love that you brought up that Hebrews passage, because it's so encouraging to just I mean, every time I read Hebrews 11, I get amped up, man. I'm like, dude, if they could do it, I can do it. If they can fight the good fight and keep faith, and like they were living towards in terrible times, especially when you read about wonderfully powerful and strong women who trusted in the Lord amidst a time that just treated women horribly, horribly, far worse than they do now. And now it's still not very good, but the point being was worse then, and they could trust in the Lord and know that the Lord is offering something better and that they will be rewarded in that. Like that is true sainthood. That is true. Like that's a warrior that like I want to be. That's like when Paul says, follow me insofar as I'm like Christ. It's like that is the point. Follow that. Like follow that example, and that you really have to fight for.
Yeah.
Now, I actually was thinking also, like, what do you think about perhaps engaging in things that have bad history, but not being aware of the bad history? Do you think that's unwise? Do you think it doesn't really matter? What do you think about that?
Once again, I think this kind of goes back into the meat sacrifice for idols.
Mm.
Assuming that what you're engaging in is not an active sinful nature, I do not think that that we can imply a sin upon someone else for seeing it, for partaking in it. You may say, oh, the film that was done here, it was a horrible production, everything was terrible, the director was a brute, but that does not transfer a sin upon someone who did not engage in that sin. It's one of those shades of meaning where does watching a sin on screen make you a sinner as well? We're talking like, oh, does me watching someone get murdered on a television screen, does that make me a murderer as well? It's a bit of a straw man argument, but I don't think just because you don't know that, oh, that movie had a horrible history in its production life, you're not at fault, if that makes any sense.
No, it's a good dialogue to have, because I think I always err on the side that it's at the very least wise to be aware of what someone's consuming, and part of that can include history. A big thing to think about is like things like recontextualization. So a movie comes out 10 years ago, but this year we find out that the entire that's I don't know, you just find out new information that puts the perspective of that movie into a totally different lens. Sometimes I think of two things. I think one, you can lose something that would make that movie better. And then in other cases, I think it can actually make things worse.
I was reading a news article last month, and uh, Disney announced that they would not be putting one of the classic Disney films up on Disney Plus.
Can I guess it? Can I guess it?
Go for it.
Is it Song of the South?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's never going to be on Disney Plus ever.
I don't know the film myself, but I'm told that it had a bunch of wrong characterizations and outright stereotypes and
very racist.
And the thing is, I'm not sure how I feel about the whole question of whether is it wrong for us to enjoy a film that was done by a racist producer or something, because it in a lot of ways it plays off this idea of cultural guilt, that it's not an individual who's at fault, it's the culture for allowing it or for partaking in it. That it's not the fault of the guy who shot up a building because he was a crazy madman. It's the fault of the gun or the lack of mental health or the spoons make me fat type deal. And at what point do we say, yes, so and so was a horrible person but made good art, or had a brilliant mind for a film but was a racist jerk in real life, and acknowledge it but not feel like we are obligated to expunge every mention of his name ever again.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you start thinking about like if bad history means And this is saying for everything. So not even things that are either contextualization or historically important to even just like recognize. Because like let's take this as example before I continue. I despise that a movie like Birth of a Nation exists because it's racist revisionist history. It's saying, and I feel like I mentioned this like every 6 episodes of the podcast, but it's a movie that basically says like the North didn't reunite the United States, the KKK did. And it's a horrible, violent, evil movie, just evil. But it's important to recognize its historical impact because we need to know how evil functions so that we can fight against it sometimes.
I was reading an interesting piece talking about the aftermath of World War II, how the Nazi history has been, it pretty much is expunged entirely from Germany.
Yes.
And it is a massive crime to show any piece of paraphernalia, to any hint of Nazi doctrine, and it is automatic. You're going to jail essentially. And yet, I remember reading this article that put forth the what they had learned in their study, that the common person did not have an understanding of what it actually meant.
Interesting.
That in their zeal to expunge evil and to propitiate for the evil that had been done, they had removed not just the manifestation, but the knowledge of that evil. And I look at our country now, and I worry because we do have these horrible things in the past. Every country has them. At what in our zeal for a whole culture of guilt, of we must atone for everything, are we going to continue this and wipe out away every trace of it and leave nothing left to learn from, to remember and say, this is why we do not? I was on Reddit talking about medical heroes who had done things to save lives, and I raised the point of a young man by name of Kirkland, who is known as the Angel of Mary's Heights. He was a Confederate soldier in the American Civil War, who at the Battle of Gettysburg was fighting at the Stone Wall, a horrible killing field with thousands of Yankee soldiers lying wounded and dying on the field in front of him. And he could not stand to hear the cry of the wounded soldiers lying there in the sun. And he begged permission to go render aid. And for like a dozen times, he crossed out into this killing field between under the guns of hundreds and thousands of soldiers, in the face of a possible instant death, to offer water and aid to these soldiers. And I got flamed for daring bring up his name because he's a Confederate soldier. Bleep him. And it's like, we forget that there was this man who said, I will not let my fellow man die alone. I'm going to bring him water. And one could argue that even to the least of these, my enemies, he showed love. He carried water to those who were thirsty. Yes, there was great sin that was being committed in the South in slavery, but do we cast aside every knowledge of what's going on?
First off, if you're still listening, thank you for continuing to listen, because I don't necessarily feel like we're off track. I think this is still very much related to Iron Man 2. We're pretty much trying to make a case for or against basically being allowed to enjoy things that have questionable history. And that ultimately does, in fact, go towards the question of like people. Like, me and my wife are not perfect people. You are listening to a podcast that is featuring sinners. We have done horrible things. A man had to die for me to make myself right with God. So, yeah, I'm a terrible person. And you have to sometimes think to yourself, like, is this person someone I'm going to listen to knowing that they are terrible? Like the mere fact that Caleb and I have to are saying that we're Christians means we're both admitting to needing somebody to die for us to make us right with God. And let me tell you something. People don't just die for people who steal something or like curse somebody out. Like and those are still sins, and yes, Christ would still die for those sins, but typically, we are all living with skeletons in the closet that are representative of something very deeply sick about us. My own personal experience is that I am just a very prideful, angry person, and my anger has exhibited in outright disrespect to people, and even in the most vile of ways, almost like as I would describe in my worst days, discarding somebody, treating somebody as though they're just like they exist. They are a stone on the path and I can just walk past them and not think about them. That is the sickness of my heart that Christ needs to die for. And while Iron Man 2 obviously is not having a production history nearly as bad as something like The Shining, like Shelley Duvall basically just like falling apart because Stanley Kubrick just treated her so poorly during the production. Iron Man 2, just like everything else, still has sinful characteristics. We're not even talking about a Weinstein film here. I mean, if we wanted to really go in that direction, we could. But the point being is like when you learn about something that might be really quite gross. I mean, that's something that Caleb and I talked about with Iron Man 1. Like Iron Man 1 has some horrible depictions of women. In this film, we've talked about horrible depictions of women, and even the fact that Black Widow like really isn't even Black Widow yet. She's just sort of like a gross male sex icon that's just like treated for no other purpose than to make two jokes that are really inappropriate. And only until like the Avengers does she actually be treated is she actually treated like a woman, like a person, like a human being who is made in the image of God. And like yeah, you still have to reconcile the fact that like these MCU movies that pretty much everybody sort of agrees is like appropriate to show their kids has bad production issues, bad evil things in them,
Has bad content issues.
bad content. Yeah, it's crazy. I don't know. I think what's interesting is like I really didn't pose that question with an answer, and perhaps that might not be wise. But I think what's important is to pose the question and start really engaging, because in certain cases, and I'll bring back the, sacrifice meat again, like it is sometimes down to conscience. Sometimes it really is down to how far do you want to engage. So, for instance, like Kat and I, like knowing that plastic is basically the scourge of the earth. In our opinion, we don't purchase single-use plastics, and when we have to, it's in a very like clinical, very focused decision to say, is there no other option? Okay, we're going to buy this single-use plastic. And that's a very different moral discussion, because that doesn't always directly relate to other people. I mean, it's more related to how the treatment of environmentalism, but it still stands like if single use plastic is really bad for the environment, and there is literally a location out in the Pacific Ocean called like it's like the I said it in I forget the title of it, but I mentioned it in my first Reformed episode. If you guys want to go back and listen to that, just going to plug that. There is literally a location in the Pacific Ocean 3 times the size of Texas that is just floating plastic. And it's like that's horrible.
I'm just trying to stick my head in. It's not like a solid lake of plastic bottles, and it's
It's like pill bottles. There's like old plastic devices and stuff.
even then it's not like you go there and it's a sea of plastic across the ocean. It's not like the reservoirs in Los Angeles that are covered in plastic balls,
Or even like what is it, like the Ganges River? That's like
it's nothing like that.
yeah. But like the point being though is like there are things that ultimately come down to where's the Lord leading you, and sometimes He might be like, for you, it's okay for you to go this direction because maybe the Lord is trying to get you to go direction. I don't know what that is, and maybe I'm just talking up my butt here, but
No, you're making sense.
okay, well, good, thank you. I'm glad at least one person thinks I'm making sense.
I
That's good.
I have a few lines when it comes to movies that I don't cross. Like, for me, horror films are right out. Horror and occult, in particular, I feel absolutely no value coming out of it. Nothing, especially nothing that would make me subject myself to that much turmoil. I mean, when we were setting up for the first Iron Man movie, I told you that I don't do it because I've got enough nightmares on my own. I don't
Yes.
need anyone else's nightmares in my head. And it once again, it's a matter of conviction that I don't think that there's any value from it, so therefore I will refuse to partake entirely.
And that's a good thing because it also shows like there's an integrity to that. And I think that's a really good thing. In fact, one of the things that as I grow, I start to think more about just individual integrities that we have and respecting those. Like in that particular instance, it would definitely be wrong of me to force you to watch a horror movie so we can talk about it, because it'd just be like, that's just so mean, first off. But then second off, it's me trying to overstep an integral characteristic of yourself, and that's just so bad. Integrity is a big thing because integrity is different for different people. Like my integrity about plastics and stuff is not the same for other people, and like that's okay. I would like to encourage other people not to use as much plastic, but I'm not thinking it's sinful for you to be like, I'm having a party and I'm gonna get some Solo cups. That's cool.
Meanwhile, I'm wearing all polyester right now. I am the plastic man. You may call me Michelin
Yes.
Man.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, it all comes down here to conviction. What convicts you? Do you think that because one person was terrible, or a lot of people were terrible in the production of a film, does that make the film unacceptable to watch? Is it the content or the producer that is the issue? That's a thought to have. But it's a personal conviction that it depends on you and your Christian liberty. Not on subject like this, we can't bind to your conscience and say, no, you cannot watch this because the producer is a bad man.
Yeah, because sometimes a broken clock is right twice a day. Can sometimes like the Lord can still use. I mean, the Lord always is using terrible people to do good things. That's kind of the only person who wasn't terrible is Jesus. Literally everybody else is terrible. And guess what? Those people were used to write scripture.
My single favorite romance story of all time on film or television comes from an anime, and anime is a genre which has so much trouble with it
Yes.
that I do not lightly recommend. In fact, I did a 20-something minute episode on it in late April, because I don't know when this is going live. In late April, I did a 20-minute episode about this anime show, and I think at least 6 or 7 minutes of it were talking about anime and its danger and being cautious.
Yeah.
And why. Because it's not just cute cartoons, it is an entire production segment like Bollywood or Hollywood.
Yeah, and it's even that has like that was one industry I forgot to mention when it comes to crunch and poor treatment of workers and stuff. And yeah, it's almost like the belief that capitalism is good might not be true, but that's another episode.
Communism is worse.
So...
Communism's worse.
Oh man. But oh man, this was great, Caleb. I'm so glad you're able to come back on, and I'm really excited for us to talk about Iron Man 3. So everybody be ready to check that out, because this will be a very interesting one. I barely remember it. All I know is people really don't like it. And I know you don't like it, so I'm really excited to talk about it.
I hate Iron Man 3 with a deep and abiding passion, particularly because I came into it with a lot of hope coming off of Iron Man 2, and I just finished rewatching the Iron Man Armored Adventures animated cartoon. If you ever saw that, it's a teen Iron Man show series that I walked into Iron Man 3. I walked out going, They've ruined everything.
Well, there's your teaser, folks, because basically come back for an hour-long discussion of how Caleb hates this movie and why it needs to be retconned. It's going to be great. Oh, man. Well, Caleb, why don't you go ahead and tell everybody where you're at again? And yeah.
You can find me pretty much anywhere a podcast is available. I run the Polymath Roundtable podcast, available on Spotify, Doodle, and Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Anchor.fm, all those places, or on my own website at polymathroundtable.com. Always have to remember. Still haven't got the website memorized. I've had it for 4 months now. I talked about media from a Christian perspective in like 20 to 25 minute sound bites that you can listen to on your commute or perhaps for lunch if you're not commuting. And I just launched a new retro film discussion series. I'd love to have you and give me a review on Podchaser.
Yeah, and I'll have a link down in the description for anybody to check out his website. And yeah, until next time, Caleb.
Yeah, until next time. It's been a blast.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Cinematic Doctrine, and thanks so much to Caleb Young for joining me on this episode of the podcast. Check out his podcast, The Polymath Roundtable, and listen to Father Polymath as he looks at all kinds of media, from movies, books, and video games through a Christian lens, and really gets down to the brass tacks of what you're engaging, all in a bite-sized runtime. Now, if you've seen Iron Man 2, what did you think of it? Do you think this film demands a revisit, or is this film as bad as it was yesterday? If you're listening on Cinematic Doctrine's website, let us know in the comments below, or shoot us an email to cinematicdoctrine@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this episode, consider leaving a review for the podcast on your respective podcast app at the end of this episode. Unlike YouTube or Reddit, there isn't really a way to let us know how we're doing with a thumbs up or thumbs down, so the best way to leave your thoughts on the podcast is to write a review on iTunes, Podchaser, or wherever you listen. And, as mentioned before, Cinematic Doctrine has a Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you're opted into a once-a-month movie poll where you decide a movie we discuss on the podcast. You also gain access to the Synduck Pre-Show, the upcoming Patreon-exclusive podcast series where my co-host Daniel and I casually talk movies, Christianity, and life itself. There are other unique benefits that come with supporting the podcast, so be sure to check that out at patreon.com/cinematic doctrine. A special shout out to those who support at the Art House Theater tier on Patreon. Thank you so much, Mom, Dad, and Melanie. You guys are the best, and your continued monetary support is greatly appreciated. All of this will be available in the show notes. Until next time, stay cool. Want some Cinematic Doctrine swag? You're in luck! We've got 3-inch Cinematic Doctrine logo stickers exclusive for Patreon supporters. Perfect for your travel mug or laptop. Head over to patreon.com/cinematic doctrine, link in the show notes, and choose the Independent Theater tier. Doing so will net you other perks too. But let's be real, the podcast stickers are the coolest perk. So get yourself some podcast stickers by supporting on Patreon.